Welcome everyone. Good morning on a quite a cold Monday morning after a nice Sunday. So I am Bonnie Chiu and I'm hosting the session together with Christine. Christine, would you like to introduce yourself first?
Yes, thank you very much, Bonnie. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I just want to let you know, before I introduce myself properly, that I'm visually impaired and I'm using a screen reader for this session, and you may occasionally hear something as my screen reader speaks, which is especially going on now because it's letting me know when people are joining the meeting, and as new people are coming in. It should settle down when we get properly started. But if you do hear something that sounds like a bit of a robotic voice in the background, I apologize. And when I'm not speaking, then I can mute it. So welcome everyone. My name's Christine Goodall. I'm the coordinator of HERE, which is a London-based equality and human rights network for equality and human rights and civil justice organisations in London. It's great to see so many people here. It's been important to us over a lot of our work around how we collect and use equality data, and particularly how we think about it both intersectionally and also about how we think that whilst sticking to what we have to provide for funders and so on, we are able to really capture the characteristics of the people that we work with in a real way that reflects what they think about themselves and is not just confined to a tick box. So that's why it's important to us. And if you're wondering why where the I Am Me title came from, it was an entry on an equality monitoring form that we actually used it here for one of our events when we started, and we'll talk more about this later, we started allowing people to more self-identify about their characteristics, and someone simply wrote I am me on the form, which I thought was like fantastic summation of what they felt. So that's where the title of the event came from. So I'll hand back to Bonnie to introduce herself before we go over some ground rules for the session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christine. Yes, now we have 61 participants, so that's all really exciting, and we'll be spending the next 15 minutes together in hopefully still an interactive session, despite the large number of participants. So my name is Bonnie Chiu. I'm the Managing Director of the Social Investment Consultancy. I've also been supporting 360 Giving recently with the DI data standards. And that was commissioned by a group of funders that are interested in DI data standards, diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I'll tell you more about that later, but my experience has really been doing a lot of work in equity and inclusion, and started out with my experience in intersectional feminism. So the intersectionality point of view that Christine just mentioned briefly will also bring to you. But really this session is for us to really convene a space to share with all of you some of those ideas. But we are experts, but also you are also the experts. So I'm just sharing my screen now. Hopefully you can see it, just in terms of the ground rules that will be shaping our session. Sarah, could you tell me if you see my presenter view, or do you just see one screen, like the full slide?
We can see presenter view, yeah.
Yeah.
So see the next slide as well.
Okay, so just talking through then some of the ground rules. This topic is difficult. So there are, that Christine mentioned, I Am Me, that really shows people see equalities data not just as data on a piece of paper, but is about our own identities and experiences. So we do need to have a leap of faith in trusting each other. And, while we might not all know each other. Let's try to trust each other in the next 15 minutes. And what you hear will be some personal or sensitive stuff. And so just hold that and have a safe and confidential space for some of these discussions to be had. You don't have to share if you don't want to. We'll have a few breakout rooms. The first one will be in pairs, so hopefully that will be less intimidating, but then there will be group discussions. But you don't have to share if you don't want to, and we'll be also sharing with you a Jamboard so that you can also input anonymously. And of course, you can also type in the chat. There's really no wrong answers. I mean, there are lots of best practices around equalities data, but there is no one size fits all approach. So hopefully you will feel that, you know, you can, your experiences are equally valid than others who are also trying to work in this space. So with those ground rules, I think, Christine, would you like to do a quick icebreaker and introduce our first interactive activity?
I will do, yes, thank you, Bonnie. So we weren't sure how many people would be joining the meeting. It's great that so many people have joined. That's brilliant. But so rather than doing an icebreaker where we just like share between the group in the normal way, we've got so many people that what I'd like you to do is invite you to contribute via the chat, and in a way it'll be an icebreaker for yourselves to get you into the flow of the session, and also people will be able to see what you've shared in the chat. So this session is all around about thinking about identity and the identity of the people that we work with, and how we work with that in a way that's meaningful. So if you'd like to just share in the chat, have a think for a couple of minutes and share in the chat if you wish. As Bonnie said, there's no compulsion to share. Something about your own identity that you're happy to share and you feel is unique to you, and really like you feel defines you as a person, and you'd be happy to share. It doesn't have to be around the standard like characteristics that we would collect on a monitoring form. It can be like anything about yourself that you really feel is like central to who you are, and that you'd be happy to share. So if you'd like just to spend a couple of minutes thinking about that and entering that in the chat, and then I'll introduce the first session. Sarah, do you have enough capacity in breakout rooms?
And Sarah, I think the next session will be in pairs, right, Christine?
Well, we did say I think originally we did it in like 3 people to make it a bit more
okay,
practical. But I mean, have you got the capacity to put people in pairs?
Yeah, that's fine.
Are
So
there enough rooms?
If I set up now, everyone will get a notification on their screen and just join the room. So
okay, great, thanks.
Yeah, we have some people commenting in the chat. So thank you for sharing. It's just also really great to see the diversity in the room, even if we all can't be together.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing, and hopefully that's got you thinking. Now, what we're going to do is you're going to be going into a breakout room just for 10 minutes. And what we'd like you to do, and this might seem a little scary, and as we said, you only need to share what you totally feel comfortable with. So with your partner, what we'd like you to do is to just see if you can make some, perhaps, you know, have a chat for a couple of minutes first, and then we'd like you to each make an assumption in your own heads to start with, or a couple of assumptions about the person that you are in the room with, and then we'd like you to share, if you feel comfortable with that, the assumption that you've made with your partner, and then to find out how how that assumption went, whether you were right or wrong. Only share what you're comfortable with, and just think when you're doing it about the assumptions that we sometimes make in life, the way we sometimes are stereotyping people without even thinking about it. So and then we'll call you back into the main room to discuss.
Welcome everyone who's coming back. I think we'll have the rest come back in the next 30 seconds or so. It will be great to have a quick debrief. So I'm pasting a Jamboard link. And if you can just put on the Jamboard, yeah, how did the assumptions game make you feel or think about? Just, yeah, quick ideas on the assumptions game. Sarah, if you can just let me know if everyone's come back, so we share the Jamboard link.
Everyone's back.
Okay.
And just to say, if you do have any trouble accessing the Jamboard, or you're not used to using Jamboard and so on, it's a bit difficult for you, then you do share your thoughts in the chat as an alternative if you can't use the Jamboard.
Thank you. And for those who haven't used the Jamboard, you'll see the toolbar on the left, and you'll be able just to paste a post-it there. Great, thank you. Yeah, a bit of discomfort, feeling awkward. Yeah, more curious to have a conversation than trying to guess. And yeah. Great. Well, I think, yeah, really interesting to see people's reflections. And part of it is also when we ask questions from our beneficiaries, from our stakeholders in order to collect equalities data. I mean, some of those feelings may also be how they feel. So we just wanted to use a bit of assumptions game, firstly, to tease out that we all have assumptions and stereotypes, and just to acknowledge that. But part of those emotions are also for us to empathize with how we sometimes might make our stakeholders feel by asking some of these questions. But we'll do a bit of a quick presentation now, just to set the scene a little bit on what good really looks like in this space. But yeah, Christine, would you like to talk about I am me as kind of why we set this topic in the first place?
Yes, yes, thank you, Bonnie. So as I mentioned briefly at the beginning, the reason why we called this session I Am Me was because we felt it really summed up what we wanted to think about in this session, and it was a real response on a real monitoring form from a real person. So really what we're trying to bring to the table about doing equalities monitoring, and there are many reasons why we might want to need to do it, but it's about thinking about, are we actually capturing our beneficiaries, or are we like slotting them into tick boxes that are manufactured either by ourselves or by outside influences? And it's about balancing those, because sometimes we may have less choice in that than that we would like, but at least it's something that we need to consider. And at the HERE Network, we have been sort of trialing different ways of using our monitoring forms to try and allow people to self-identify more how they would wish. As people will know, especially there's lots of tensions around different categories of data, ethnicity data being one, but many other other categories. So often allowing people to identify themselves by having a box which says, in your own words, although it can be, and Bonnie will touch on this further, about it can be difficult with like comparing data, it can be a brilliant way of allowing people to really express who they are and really enlighten us about the richness of our service users, our members, our beneficiaries. So I'll hand back to Bonnie now.
Thank you. And yeah, from this topic of I am me, I think two really important elements in equalities data that we want you to take away. One is self-identification, so allowing the space for that, but also agency to be defining that. And how can we make sure our forms and all the bureaucracy doesn't distract us from these two fundamental principles. So just a quick overview, collection of equalities data in the charity sector. All of you are probably doing some kind of equalities data monitoring and collection, or are interested in this topic. We'll have a breakout room discussion very shortly, and it will be great if you can discuss in your room, actually reflecting on why you're collecting the equalities data in the first place. But before talking about why, I want to talk about why not, because we have seen quite a lot of resistance actually to collecting equalities data, and some of them for very valid reasons. One is the tick box exercise, the monitoring forms that may contrast with the very trust-based ways of working among charities. You will be collecting sensitive information through equalities data, so there are lots of GDPR concerns that we often get from charities. Oh, how are we going to store the data? And we can touch upon some of the ways to mitigate that, but too much paperwork in the charity sector. Collecting equalities data is not mandatory in the same way it is for public sector. And depending on the kinds of charities you are or that you work with, there are cultural nuances as well with collecting equalities data that we need to bear in mind. So some of these barriers could feel quite insurmountable, and therefore charities might not embark on it. But now increasingly funders requiring equalities data to be collected. And ultimately, what we think is really, really important about equalities data is actually about the mission, to increase the impact on the most marginalized, to understand who's being reached, who's not being reached, to ensure that everyone can be reached through your services, and to identify any gaps in needs in service provision. So I think those why not reasons we often hear are actually can be overcome, which we'll touch upon very quickly, but let's really root it in our understanding and hopefully instilling with you some passion in collecting equalities data, because those barriers could be quite hard to overcome, and it might take a lot of effort as well for you to galvanize your team around collecting equalities data. What I find interesting, just a note on funders, this is from Glass Pockets, which is a US organization that collects data around foundations. There is not equivalent in the UK, but what I found interesting is while funders are demanding charities to be collecting equalities data, their grantees to be collecting equalities data, actually only 16% of foundations are currently collecting their own diversity and publishing their own diversity data. So you do see, understanding that funders now require you to do that. But I just want to make a quick note that the foundation sector also has a journey to go on to ensure that they are collecting also their own diversity data. And equalities data are also not one in all. So we use equalities data as an umbrella term, but actually there's so many different categories within equalities data, and some categories we've heard and we've found that are more difficult to collect. So this is a graph from ONS, the government agency that kind of deals with anything statistics. You would see that they have plotted the categories of information they have of populations. This is not only around protected characteristics in the Equalities Act, is also other things such as qualifications held, and a number of rooms, a number of bedrooms, so there are different types of things that they're collecting. But if we zoom into what we traditionally look at as equalities data, so the protected characteristics as well as other similar areas such as class, socioeconomic backgrounds, you see that in the middle, so the lower, the more left kind of something is on this chart, the poorer the coverage is and the quality of the data. And you find that ethnic group is somewhere kind of in the middle, whereas age and sex is very much at the top right quadrant. So, you know, ethnic group is quite a difficult one actually to be capturing data, and so is disability and long-term health conditions. And these two are particular categories that Christine and I have done quite a lot of work around. So yeah, we just want to highlight that again, not all categories are the same. So you will definitely find more barriers for certain categories than others. And happy to answer any questions people might have when it comes to the specific categories. This concept of intersectionality is really recognizing that all of us have so many different identities. We've already seen that in the icebreaker when you put in your identities in the chat. Some of the identities are protected by Equalities Act, some are not. But how do we recognize and measure the different intersecting identities we have, noting that some of them, such as gender, if you're women with disability, that experience is very different from a woman and a man with disability. So how do you capture some of the compounding effects of multiple disadvantage is also a really big challenge in equalities data. But I think what we would like to impart on is for you to think of equalities data collection from this intersectional lens. And there are some ways that we can practically do that. For example, by making sure that you are collecting at least multiple dimensions of your participants' identities, and that you're able to analyze your data based on some of those intersecting identities. So for example, understanding how your beneficiaries, if they are women of color, how they experience the program compared to women as a group. But some of the tensions that you will be navigating, just to summarize, and I can give you some kind of practical examples, yeah, really allowing for identification, but also the need for harmonization for analysis. So a very practical tool that we can support you with, Christy will share the resources towards the end, but the DEI data standards that have been created in the past few months, and also that leverages the work that Christine and her team has done before around disability data, that you do use categories but allow for a self-identification field. So you use basically both. And make sure that you are not just analyzing the quantitative data from those categories, but also qualitative data. So, you know, you're not just using the field just for people to self-identify, but you actually will look into them as part of your analysis. Another tension is need for information, but also anonymity and feelings of safety. So as a default, we encourage equalities data collection, that you should have a discussion with your beneficiaries before you actually ask them to fill in a form. And some of these questions, should that be anonymous or not, you can have a discussion with your beneficiaries. I mean, I've personally seen organizations that have done monitoring forms in an anonymous manner, some who have done it with the beneficiaries' names attached. It really does depend, but it comes back to having the agency allowing your beneficiaries to actually tell you what they would prefer. So having some focus groups or even survey to understand what people might prefer. But of course, the more anonymous the data are, the easier it is for you to comply with GDPR. But with anonymity, it becomes hard to then track whether to link the outcomes data, if you're using it from an evaluation perspective, to link it to the demographics data. The third tension is understanding intersectionality, but risk of asking too many questions. So I think one tip that I personally have is to understand, again, your beneficiaries. Are there categories that matter the most to them, and perhaps prioritize 2 to 3 to start with, and then having an open field for other types of identities to be captured. But starting small and then building on top of that, rather than overwhelming your beneficiaries with 20 questions in your first interaction with them. But perhaps you also noted any other tensions that you'd like us to cover. But we and Poonam, I saw you have a question that you put in the chat that perhaps I can revisit after your breakout rooms. But now we will have a breakout room discussion, which is exactly this question: how to balance complexity and nuances and not wanting too detailed forms. And it's also just a chance for you to connect with your peers, reflecting on what we've covered so far. We'll use the same Jamboard to be collating your feedback. So if you turn to the second slide on the Jamboard, you'll be able to input your needs. But before I get you off, and I think we'll have groups of 3 or so, I think it comes back to my point earlier, talking to your users, your beneficiaries, your stakeholders. Some of you might have seen the co-production ladder, which is used a lot in service design and delivery. Ultimately, well, this is just a ladder on how people can participate in service design. And if we use that in equalities data, actually, how are we currently coming up with questions around equalities data? How much can the users and staff, especially frontline staff, actually work together to define equalities data? So that this might just be another way for you to think about, because part of, I think, the answers to the question on balancing complexity and nuances really comes back to the beneficiaries and what is most appropriate for them. And the more we can engage them in those defining those answers, the better that will be. So I think we have around 10 minutes for the next breakout room, and then we'll just do wrap up when you come back. For those of you who are looking at Jamboard, we already see some good tips coming from one another. So, Christine, maybe a question for you to answer. As a small organization, how can we create a questionnaire that allows for self-identity?
Right, thank you. Yes, so as I mentioned, that's what we've been trying to do. So I think first of all, carry on using the categories that you use. Get the best information you can about the categories, and one way of doing that is if you have links with any organizations that work with that group of people, for example, disabled people's organizations in your area and so on. It's often quite a good way to consult on what categories you're using and whether they are relevant and so on. So get the best categories that you can use, and then perhaps add in a box under each category, which allows people to enter information in their own words. And in our form, we've just called it in your own words. But I think if you're going to do that, the key to that is putting an introduction on your form, explaining that you're trying out different ways of collecting information, and that there is a box that you can use if you don't feel that the categories that are included in the form adequately sum up what you would like to say. Then you're welcome to use in your own words. And if anyone would like to contact me, if you want to ask the organisers for my email address, I'll be happy to send you the form that we're currently trying out, so that you can see an example of exactly what I mean.
Great, thank you, Christine. We have a few other questions that have come in. One is about how to approach this balance in online questionnaires when we are not able to have direct contact with customers and find it difficult to consult. So, Christine, you mentioned an example about kind of advice line and how to approach that versus like an in-person program. Do you want to just quickly comment on that?
Yes, I suppose that isn't so much about online as sort of around thinking about the context that you're collecting it in. So I'm not quite sure if the question was like around like just using an online form where you're not having that any direct interaction with people. I think if you're using online forms and you're just sending people a link to complete something, again, I think one of the keys to that is having a really good introduction. And I think this applies to all equalities monitoring, really explaining to people why you're collecting it. So especially if it's online, then it's more impersonal. Having a really good introduction first. This is why we're collecting this. This is why we're asking you for this. You're really helping us by providing this information. This is how you're helping us. This is what we will do with it. This is why it's important to us. So I think having that introduction first is really, really important if you're doing something online and expecting and wanting people to.
And maybe also considering multimedia, maybe having a video to explain why you're doing it and have some of the people who've done it on their experiences. But we only have 1 minute left, so I do need to wrap up. There is a question about intersectionality that I have put in the chat. There's a question about inclusive language, and definitely I think that is an ongoing discussion that actually a lot of the monitoring forms are not using inclusive language. And then that idea about capturing different people's experiences without lumping them into broader box. And I think that's just the balance that we have to continue to strike. And
if people do want to share an email address with their questions in the chat, then I'll be happy to look at the chat afterwards and respond to any questions if people, or if people haven't had time to do that, if they want to contact me with their questions, I'm very happy to follow up after the session.
Thank you so much, Christine. I'll put your email in the chat. And then also I pasted 2 links, the DI data standards that has a taxonomy that you can look at. And there's more events planning in the works for the DI data standards, and also the work that Christine has done around disability data. So, well,
and also sorry, buddy. And also just to quickly say that if you are in London, do check out the DataWise London pages on Superhighway's website, and here and DataKind are partners in that. And there are lots and lots of free sessions there if you're in London that can help support you with all kinds of data and tech related issues.
Thank you, everyone. And I hope you took something away from this session. And please do get in touch if you have any other questions.